Hey, everybody. On behalf of the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life here at Columbia, welcome to the latest event in our Religion and Climate series, organized according to elements: earth, water, fire, and air. Today, we're rounding out our series with an event titled Air: Climate Change, Atmospherics, and the Unseen in India and West Papua. My name's Justine Ellis, and from all of us at IRCPL, we are so glad you decided to join us. Thank you. For anyone who's new to our work, IRCPL is the public programming, research support, and publishing hub at Columbia on the intersection of religion and public life. In terms of what's about to happen, we'll have some framing remarks, a moderated conversation with Professors Sophie Chao and Nikita Simpson, alongside our moderator, Dr. Raffaella Taylor-Seymour, followed by Q&A. As the program gets underway, please start thinking about your questions. You can select the Q&A button at the bottom of your webinar screen and type your questions into the text field at any time during the program. So we invite you to enter in those questions and start thinking about them as we get started. We'll gather them for the end. As we get into it, I also want to recognize the work of current IRCPL staff in making today's program possible. So big, warm thank you to everyone who helped us get this off the ground. And now, without further ado, our speakers. They have extensive bios, so I will highlight just a few key pieces in relation to today's conversation. To start alphabetically, Dr. Sophie Chao's research investigates the intersections of indigeneity, ecology, capitalism, health, and justice in the Pacific, with a particular ethnographic focus on the Indonesian-occupied region of West Papua. She's the author of In the Shadow of the Palms, More Than Human Becomings in West Papua, and co-editor of The Promise of Multi-Species Justice, both published by Duke University Press. Current research examines Indigenous experiences and theories of hunger in West Papua and wildlife-human entanglements in settler Australia. At the University of Sydney, she's also the co-lead of the Sydney Environment Institute's Biocultural Diversity Research Team and executive committee member of the Sydney Southeast Asian Centre. She previously worked for the human rights organization Forest Peoples Program in Indonesia, supporting the rights of forest-dwelling Indigenous peoples to their customary lands, resources, and livelihood. And now Dr. Nikita Simpson is a reader in anthropology at SOAS, University of London, and the co-director of the Center for Anthropology and Mental Health Research and Action. She researches and provides policy advisory on mental health, care, and inequality. She completed her doctoral studies at LSE, where her research focused on embodied forms of illness and mental distress amongst the Gadi tribal women in Himalayan North India. She has a forthcoming book manuscript, so be on the lookout, titled Tension, Mental Health Distress in an Out-of-the-Way Place, that is under contract with Duke University Press. She's currently pursuing multiple new projects, one focused on housing, racial inequality, and embodied distress in the UK, looking at the ways in which encounters with mold, disrepair, and state discipline in temporary accommodation generate particular forms of racial trauma. And another project is focused on ecological distress in the Himalayan region, investigating the mental health impacts of invasive weed species, changing weather patterns, and land dispossession. Nikita is also a visiting research associate at the Sydney University Policy Lab, where she is advising on the Australia Cares project. And last but certainly not least, our moderator is IRCPL's very own Dr. Raffaella Taylor-Seymour. Raffaella, in addition to serving as IRCPL's postdoctoral research scholar, where she helps lead the Institute's Religion and Climate portfolio, is a lecturer in the Department of Religion at Columbia University. And her research examines religious life in the context of struggles over gender, sexuality, and the environment in Zimbabwe. And she holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago. And now, without further ado, I will pass it to you, Raffaella.
Thank you so much, Justine. It's really a pleasure to welcome everyone to the final event in this series, IRCPL's Elements series, which is, as Justine mentioned, part of our wider project on religion and climate. Today's event is the last of 4 talks and conversations that take the elements, earth, water, fire, air, as lenses for engaging with specific climate struggles and the debates they ignite. The aim of working with these categories is to destabilize and reimagine some of the concepts and presuppositions that we inherit in both the environmental humanities and the study of religion. For those joining us for the first time, we're really delighted to have you with us. To orient everyone, I'll briefly recapitulate aspects of the framing remarks I've provided at previous events, which touch on some of the conversation and debates that this series emerges out of. In recent years, there has been a proliferation of texts that explicitly or implicitly engage questions about the relationship between climate and religion. Since at least Lynn White Jr. in the 1960s, a range of authors have asked whether Christianity, specifically in its Western and Protestant iterations, might have contributed to attributes that underpin the climate crisis. In a different vein, others have posited that Enlightenment philosophy, the rise of secularism, and the forces of disenchantment have together worked to strip the world of meaning and render matter inert. The novelist Amitav Ghosh, a previous speaker at IRCPL, points out that widespread exploitation of fossil fuels began at the moment that Western thought started to imagine humans as distinct from nature, and Western powers began to colonize land and people to fuel their economic rise. Similarly, the historian Faiza Zakaria notes that colonization not only dispossessed and extracted in a material sense, but also ruptured worlds that encompass spirits, ancestors, and other non-human beings. The Anishinaabe critic Kyle Powys-White points out that for Indigenous peoples in the Americas, the climate apocalypse, with its attendant fears of dispossession, forced relocation, and human extinction, came long ago. In his words, Indigenous peoples already inhabit what our ancestors would have characterized as a dystopian future. As such, colonial forms of violence cross-cut boundaries between material and immaterial, and anti-colonial struggles often involve efforts to reconstitute these webs of connection as well as to regain sovereignty. Yet for Ghosh, the climate crisis ultimately undoes the mirage that humans, in the mold of Western man, can unceasingly manipulate inert matter to their will. In his view, growing awareness of the vast scale and complexity of the interconnections that surround us are reattuning people to the vitality of materiality and potentially awakening new religious sensibilities. Ghosh is just one among a wide array of philosophers, social critics, and environmentalists, penning climate polemics that percolate with religious idioms, dialects, and sensibilities, bringing with them lines of argument that not long ago would likely have been dismissed as mystical or romantic. For those of us with commitments to the study of religion, then, this moment pushes us to think creatively about how the resources of our field might contribute to these debates. This series picks up on various threads of these intersecting conversations. We work with an expansive understanding of religion that seeks to draw in a wide array of modes for thinking about the cosmos and the place of humans and other beings within it. At the same time, we hope to show that engaging with climate forces a further unsettling of that famously tricky concept, religion, and its intertwinement with multiple ways of knowing, being, seeing, and thinking. In today's conversation, we turn to the theme of air in the context of India, West Papua, and the United Kingdom. In some ways, air is the most abstract of the elements we have structured these conversations around. Unlike the violent potential of fire, the regenerative qualities of water, or the anchoring capacities of the earth, air is diffuse. Nonetheless, it is a frequent object of religious imagination. Air as breath or spirit or soul is a central concern in many traditions, while at the same time, air is a frequent site of the unseen, the zone of spirits, deities, ancestors, gods, demons, and the otherwise. Alongside these expansive religious connotations, recent work in the environmental humanities has emerged around the idea of atmospherics, a body of literature that embraces the dual meaning of the word atmosphere as both the air that we breathe and the prevailing mood or affective intensity of a place or time. In this vein, we ask about the breathability of the air in the places we dwell, alongside the moods, feelings, and tensions that pervade them. Sophie Chao and Nikita Simpson work in distinct contexts, yet both their work engages ethnographically with the borderland between the politics of environmental change and the affective or subjective experiences that accompany it. In this conversation, we are interested in religion in the broadest sense, an examination of how people work out questions of meaning, survival, and endurance against the backdrop of rapidly changing ecologies and atmospheres. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Chao to introduce her work. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm joining you this morning from the unceded lands of the Gadigal people here in Australia. And I want to start by acknowledging Gadigal elders, past, present, and emergent, and also pay my respects to Gadigal kin, both human, animal, vegetal, and elemental. The lands of Gadigal, like those of Indigenous peoples the world over, were taken without treaty, compensation, or consent. They are lands whose more than human stories and worlds have long been stolen, silenced, or sanitized, and they are also lands of ongoing Indigenous survivance, persistence, and resurgence. Indigenous lands always have been, always will be. A huge, huge thank you to the Institute and particularly to Raffaella, Justine, for hosting this series and inviting me to speak within it. Thanks to all of you who are tuning in for this conversation. And thank you to Nikita for being in dialogue with me. It's always such a joy and such a gift to think with and learn from you. So I'm coming to this conversation as an environmental anthropologist and environmental humanities scholar whose fieldwork has largely centered on West Papua, which is the western half of the island of New Guinea that has been settler occupied by Indonesia since the early 1960s. And the photograph I'm showing you here was taken during one such period of fieldwork in Papua, particularly among one indigenous community, the Marind people, who in the last decade or so now have seen some 2 million hectares of their traditional forests converted to industrial oil palm plantations. And a lot of my research has centered on trying to grapple with the ways in which Indigenous Marind people, in all their heterogeneity, experience and theorize processes of social and environmental change in a context of settler colonization, agribusiness development, and pervasive discourses of modernization, and how these changes reconfigure their sense of being, of becoming, and of belonging. And when I say Indigenous experiences, I'm referring here both to their subjection to settler capitalist violence and to the often creative ways in which they contest this violence through what Ruha Benjamin might term the abundant imagination. I'm also really interested in questions of justice, particularly philosophies, practices, and protocols of multi-species justice, and how reconfiguring the subject of justice beyond the human and the individual might help to enrich, or perhaps in the context of this seminar, oxygenate our understandings of what fairness and justice might feel like, look like, sound like, taste like, mean across space and across time. How this all connects to questions of air, and this is something, of course, that I'm looking forward to delving into in more depth in the dialogue. My research has uncovered some really interesting insights on, first of all, air as kin. So I'm thinking here about Indigenous understandings of clouds, thunder, rain, fog, dew, as a form of companion in the course of everyday life. Also, air is contaminate and contaminant. And connecting back to this image here, I'm thinking about air pollution resulting from burning, air pollution resulting from pesticide and fertilizer uses on in industrial landscapes. And thirdly, air as concept. And here I'm going to talk about ideas of air as an atmospheric of unease, uncertainty, opacity, a kind of crisis of visibility in both material and semiotic terms, to use sort of Haraway's language. So air as kin, contaminant, and concept are ideas I'd love to explore with you more all within a broader context of climate change, which, as Raffaella so beautifully puts, quoting from Carl Powis White, is both an emergent reality for Marine in Papua and also a kind of colonial déjà vu that amplifies pre-existing inequalities and degrees of breathability in this plantation frontier, and also broader ideas of religiosity in a world where the more than human and the more than secular always operate in conjunction with one another, a world in which ancestors, both continue to exist within the landscape and demand that we take seriously the question of what ancestors we want to become for those who will come afterwards. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to think through religion and climate change more deeply here through the ideas of atmospherics and air that we're being presented with. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sophie. I might take over from you, if that's okay, with an image that I think is quite resonant in a particular way. Um, so thank you so much for having me. It's just such a delight to be here with Sophie and Raffaella, who I think we kind of began this conversation thinking together about ecological distress last year. And so it's amazing to continue to deepen our conversation with each other. I'm very influenced by both Raffaella and Sophie's work, particularly as I suppose, move into thinking about questions of the environment and religiosity and relationships of the community I've worked with More Than Human Others, as they're affected by ecological change. Because really, unlike Sophie and unlike Raffaella, I'm not an environmental anthropologist, but an anthropologist of mental health. Such that my engagement with air is primarily in thinking about the affective and emotional atmospheres that are generated by people's relations with the environment, with more than human others, non-human others, and through the kind of very substances and matters of the body and of the wider world. So my work has primarily been in the Indian Western Himalayan state of Himachal Pradesh, working with the Gadi scheduled tribe. So the Gadi community are a formerly agropastoralist transhumant community who live in this beautiful, stunning place that you can see on the screen. The Gadi for centuries have practiced agropastoralism, crossing over those high passes that you can see in the image and moving between the low plain lands of Kangra and the Shivalik Hills and up to the high summer pastures of Chamba on the other side of those mountains. However, over the last century, this community has really experienced a very rapid change in livelihood. They've experienced the enclosure of their lands. They've experienced a real kind of convergence of environmental factors like pollution of the air, but as well as pollution of the soils, like the invasive species of things like lantana weed, overrunning pastures that are poisonous to sheep and goats, and the urbanization of these kind of previously very sparsely settled places, making it impossible to practice agropastoralism. Now, what's really interesting about that process of environmental change and land kind of enclosure is that it's also deeply unsettled the social relationships that kind of sustain that economy, including relationships of caste, social hierarchy of class, of gender, and of the question of tribal belonging, such that the present for the Gadi people is deeply fraught. The kind of very negotiations of what it means to be a Gadi, who counts as a Gadi according to different caste groups, and what it means to articulate Gadi femininity or masculinity across generations is kind of fractured. So this generates kind of affective glitches, right, in these relationships, kind of experiences of relational rift that I came to understand through this language of tension. Tension was a term that was used in everyday scrapes and strains of life, where people said, oh, I have tension because my daughter got home late from school or something like that. But also, as I kind of listened more deeply to the uses of this term, and I began to see how it was connected to different forms of articulations of distress and different atmospheres of affect, I came to realize that this was something deeper. It was a kind of affective experience of the uncertainty this community was experiencing. I didn't think about that really in relation to the breakdown of the environment when I wrote my PhD, and really until I started to engage with Sophie and Raffaella's work and coming back to the field numerous times, realizing that a lot of the data that I'd collected about this place, that kind of atmosphere, that sense of uncertainty in the air, was also related to fractured relationships with non-human place-based gods and with animals and with kind of different kinds of sacred plants and things like that. So their works really helped me to try and understand that, and I hope to kind of unpick that further in the discussion. I will stop there. I have another project that has relevance, but maybe it will come out in the discussion.
Okay, thank you so much, Nikita. I'm going to pick up actually exactly where you left off, which is to kind of take us into this theme of religion, right? So obviously this series approaches climate change from the perspective of religion. And as I kind of alluded to already in my opening comments, it's the air's and intangibility that makes it this prime site for a variety of unseen yet perceived forces, spirits and demons, the souls of departed kin, ancestors, benevolent spirits, and so on. So I was wondering if you could, both of you, or one at a time, flesh out what kinds of beings, forces, or ideas that are associated with the air in the context that you work. And, a second question is, are they changing as the landscape or the local ecologies change? And I think if we go to Sophie first and then Nikita.
Thanks so much. I really love this starting point for the conversation, thinking through that intangibility or diffuseness as a site for reckoning with the unseen yet the perceived. And in thinking through that, of course, I'm thinking with the Marisol de la Cadena's fantastic 2015 essay, Uncommoning Nature, in which she coined this term, the anthropo not seen, SEEN, to talk about the sort of invisibilization, the dispossession, the annihilation of peoples, of places, of life forms, relations, processes, and that become sort of normalized, normativized under colonial and neo-colonial regimes, all of which she argues this sort of, invisibilization being, of course, anchored or tethered to a rigid, fictive divide between the human and the non-human. And of course, that argument can, to some extent, also be made against the Anthropocene discourse, right? That by centering the anthropos as a generic singular category kind of perpetuates or replicates that kind of divide. Yes, I mean, air forms are in many ways pregnant with presence on the Papuan plantation frontier, where I've been conducting my field work. The air, in its myriad manifestations, is a sibling in indigenous parlance, namek, or a grandparent for that matter. It's an intergenerational kind of substance. So I'm thinking here of examples like the fog, like dew, like clouds, like other airborne formations, thunder, lightning, and so forth. The wind, all of these entities, first of all, are named within an incredibly complex taxonomy of kinship, right? That then connects different clans within Marian society to particular beings with whom they have particular kinds of reciprocal obligations within a broader kind of ecology of care and kinship and responsibility. So there is the Thunder Clan, there is the Clan of the Fog, there is the Clan of the Wind, and this is not a kinship of ownership over these particular aerial formations. Rather, it's one of obligation, right? And here I'm kind of using Vinciane Desprez' language. Obligation is a sort of relationship of reciprocity, of reverence, and of care, essentially. Another way in which air forms come to matter is that many of these air forms were either created by or embody ancestral spirits, ancestral creator spirits who are known as Dema in Marine language, and who, really formed all life forms here in the broadest sense of the term, to include both bios and beyond bios beings like air, at the beginning of time from a sort of primordial mud, and who continue to inhabit and animate the landscape, who continue to create matter and shape the life of matter and the matter of life. And a lot of these ancestral forces are now being transformed because of the sort of large-scale ecological ruptures and rifts that are reconfiguring this landscape. So deforestation, the introduction of oil palm monocultures, even the establishment of conservation zones that might be preserving so-called wildernesses, but are doing so in a way that severs indigenous inhabitants from these landscapes by reframing them as sort of places that should be devoid of human influence, save that of external experts and conservation scientists, of course. So what's been really interesting to document in Merauke, in Papua, where I do my fieldwork, is the ways in which these changes are then said to change the ways in which ancestors relate to humans. So on the one hand, there's the prevalent discourse of ancestors now sort of fleeing the landscape as their environments become degraded and diminished. That sits alongside a discourse in which ancestors are exerting punitive influence or retribution on the humans who are failing to care for the landscape, for instance, by inflicting hunger, disease, illness upon these human communities who are no longer fulfilling their obligations towards the ancestors. And then the other, probably the most sort of disturbing of discourses that I heard in the field was this idea that perhaps ancestors are now colluding or working with the state and with agribusiness corporations to further the kinds of transformations that we are talking about here. So the idea that somehow they have been co-opted into the project of modernity and no longer siding with communities, but rather with corporations. So there's all kinds of ambiguities at play in terms of how these changes are shaping subjectivity within the plantation frontier. And when it comes to air forms, one of the most another disturbing reality that people talked about was the ways in which the pollution of air, through forest burning in particular, is producing a kind of ancestrophagy. So people are eating the ancestors by the very act of breathing in air that is now filled with particulate matter that is the remains of their non-human kin and non-human ancestors, right? And this is something that they do unwittingly. So it's a kind of strange eating of the ancestors, which is both deeply, it's wrong story, to use Tyson Yunkaporta's term, and it also begs the question of what these forms of strange ingestion and indigestion, for that matter, help us think through when it comes to what kind of ancestors we become and what kind of landscapes we inherit and transmit.
Thanks, Sophie. Should I jump in, Raffaella? Yeah. Sophie, I can't wait for your new book and to hear more about these kind of processes of ingestion. And I suppose what I find really interesting about thinking with air and thinking with the kind of miasmic qualities of different forms of charged air is that we join together atmospheres and bodies in really contingent ways. So we start to think in a way that is much less structured and structural, and we start to think about the flows and substances that generate difference and that then generate affect, and what kinds of constellations of bodies, affects, and substances and things are kind of charted. So an anthropologist can kind of work through those kind of constellations in order to kind of yield a description of reality or description of the ethnographic encounter that is much less structured or representative. I think it's more fluid, and that's what I really like about your work. And I think I really only came to that after my thesis. So I wrote a thesis about the Gadi people that was really structuralist. It was a feminist political economy thesis, about these processes of land enclosure that was, I used people like Silvia Frederici or to try and understand these processes of change, and therefore distress kind of was an exhaust of those processes of relational rupture. But it wasn't until after I'd finished my thesis and I'd started to read some of this literature on atmospheres, frequencies, on kind of different forms of affective constellations, moods, that I started to really go back to that data and kind of unyoke its tightness, to kind of stop trying to taxonomize forms of distress, or stop trying to associate or lock in certain forms of distress with certain symptoms or bodily forms or generations or experiences. And I started to loosen, I suppose, my control over these, how I want to control my ethnographic data. So I think that the thinking with air helped me to do that, or thinking with atmospheres helped me to do that. Because one of the things I realized when I went back to my field notes was that people talked about tension as rolling in from the plains. They use these kind of metaphors. So this place is really struck by very intense monsoons, and you have a kind of fault line between the mountains and the plains, where you have like pine trees in the mountains, then mango trees in the plains, for example. And when clouds hit this place, it's a very physical experience. You're sitting in your house and a cloud will move through your house and through your body. So these kinds of metaphors of mutuality, permeability of bodies are really common, and they're really reflective of the kind of environment that Gadi people live in. But they spoke about tension differently, and here I think there's an interesting link to these kind of uncanny forces, these forms of horror, that where something that is normal like a cloud, that is beautiful like a cloud, then becomes a kind of uncanny, unsettling, disorientating force. And I think that's what tension was. People spoke about tension as rolling in, particularly where the plains have become very hot. You have these thermal landscapes in the plains that are becoming uninhabitable in North India, and more people are moving to the mountains. So tension rolling in is also speaking to processes of urbanization and kind of, I suppose, the enclosure of land, which is really, on one hand, positive for the Gadi people. Their land becomes really profitable. They suddenly are able to join the kind of lower rungs of a middle class, but at what cost? How does that unsettle their kind of obligations to place-based gods, their ability to demonstrate mutuality with animals, to keep herds, to be able to go to the mountains, to meet the spirits, and to be able to cross the passes, which are critical to Gadi aesthetics. So you have this kind of crisis of aesthetic politics, of what does it mean to be a Gadi if I can't do all of these things that allow me to keep my compact with the land. And for the Gadis who are kind of might be called, or have been called by other scholars, animistic Shaivites, this was a compact with Lord Shiva. So to be able to live not just worship Lord Shiva through the practice of agropastoralism, but actually to live in the image of Lord Shiva, or to through the for men to be able to go with the herd, and for women to be able to worship particular kinds of place-based gods. So the inability to do that, even though life is getting better, one is able to start sending your children to school, one is able to not go hungry, life is easier, creates this kind of double movement that generates this kind of affective disorientation that people spoke about as tension. And I think air is also relevant here in the sense that the ethnographic encounter with that experience wasn't only a narrative encounter, right? So you spend time in a Gadi house where these kind of relationships are in tension, and you feel this atmosphere of distress, and it permeates your body. And I suppose most of my work was done with a collaborator who I won't name here for purposes of anonymity, but he was a former Gadi shepherd. And he, we would spend time in these spaces with people expressing deep forms of distress. But before we even got to those stories, we could kind of tell, right? You kind of enter a space that's laden with affective charge. And I think that's a common experience in any kind of ethnography, but I think particularly when you follow these kind of currents of tension that settle in different people's bodies in different ways. So I'll stop there, but can elaborate further down the line.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm actually hoping this next question will allow you both to kind of to unpack these ideas even more. So, I think of all of these terms that we're working with is sort of, it is the most diffuse, and in some ways it's an ambiguous and open-ended concept. And so one of the ways that we've sort of indexed this is by, using this idea of atmospherics and the unseen in the subtitle to today's event. And really this question is to ask, are we right to make that association in your context? Does air overlap with ideas of atmospherics and the unseen in, your respective contexts? So I'll hand it to Sophie and then Nikita.
Thanks so much. I just want to say, Nikita, I too cannot wait to get hold of your book. I really love what you were describing just now in terms of, or earlier on sort of affective glitches and the ways in which identities become fractured in worlds where, that may be relational, but wherein not all relations are good, to borrow sort of Kim Tolber's language, and where ideas of permeability and porosity can be, but are not always life-sustaining, and can be also deeply violent and diminishing. Yeah, I mean, I think I want to answer this question by picking up on this idea of air as concept, from the kind of kinship contaminant concept tripartite approach I'm sort of taking to the substance. And yes, air very much sits in relation to atmospherics, in light of the ways in which people whom I'm learning from in Papua draw on air formations and transformations and disfigurations, from air pollution, forest burning, pesticides, filling up their breathing spaces, to then kind of abstractify these ideas into a concept that is hugely prevalent in describing their life worlds. And that concept is abu-abu, which in Indonesian means both gray and uncertain, right? So it's talking both about the grayness of the air itself, which is filled with smoke and haze and smog. It's talking about the rivers that have become gray because of these, palm oil mill effluents and pollutants. But it's also talking about the grayness of an uncertain world, which, not unlike what Nikita has described in the Gadi context, is a world that is both promissory and problematic. It's a world that's both enabling and diminishing. It's a world in which people's climactic corporealities, I'm borrowing a term from Blanche Verly here, is changing as they're beginning to weather together in very, very different ways on this plantation frontier. Abu Abu, it's an indigenous concept. It's one that speaks to a kind of a generalized sense of ambiguity and inchoateness and opacity in this place where loss and destruction sit alongside the emergence of new ecological forms and futures, the plantation being one of them. It's a concept that speaks to forms of unseen-ness and diffuseness that are becoming visible for all the wrong reasons, right? One should not see air. That one can see air because it is so highly polluted and laden with toxins is the wrong reason for which it's becoming visible, right? It's a concept that speaks to the sort of uncanny, going back to Nikita's term there, the uncanniness of what it means to live with chemicals in the air we breathe as people start to inhabit new alter lives. And here I'm borrowing Murphy's term, of course, right? Lives that are being altered, transformed, that are not quite what they were before, and no one's really sure what they will become in the future, right? It's not an afterlife, it's an alter life, an altered life. And I think, atmosphere works really well in thinking through these material changes as affect. The atmospheres of life on this plantation frontier are laden with a sense of sensory alienation from these now transforming environments, a sense of sensory disorientation and dislocation as people lose the kind of referential markers in the landscape that once guided them in space and also in time for that matter. It's an atmosphere of doubt when one is never sure who's going to sell their land next or who's entered a land contract with the corporation they were not once staunchly opposed to. It's an atmosphere of rumor and anxiety as mistrust starts to take over relationships within families and across villages and settlements. It's an atmosphere of sorrow and grief and mourning for more than human endings and losses. And it's an atmosphere of uncertainty and opacity that also applies to the being of oil palm that is taking over indigenous lands. It's not a native species, and it's a being whose own desires and demands and drive are very much unknown to many of the inhabitants of this plantation frontier. So I think there's something really powerful about pairing the opacity of air, the muddied materialities of these spaces with the sort of uncertainty and inchoateness of what it means to be and to become, as a human, as a non-human for that matter, within these spaces. And at the same time, of course, that opacity, that abu-abu-ness, is also a space of potentiality, right? Because muddiness refuses classificatory schemes. And in the process, in some ways, can also be a way of pushing against the erasures of classificatory schemes in the very first instance, right? So I think there's something powerful to be said here about how opacity can be both enabling and diminishing, a way of resisting, schemata of beings that can sometimes be fixed or imposed, and that is also a way of refusing, I guess, the boundaries of being that settler colonial regimes so often, introduce and normalize in these settler colonized spaces.
Oh, Sophie, that phrase pushing against the erasures of classificatory schemes, I think that's really helpful in thinking both empirically, like interpreting the ethnography that maybe both the similarity between tension and Abu Abu as kind of emic theories of these kind of unsettling experiences of social change, the embodied costs of these social change and the rupture of relationalities with kin and more than human beings. But it's also a really helpful theoretical tool for what thinking atmospherically or thinking with air can do. And I mean, as I said before, I think what was so helpful about thinking with atmosphere for me was actually really pointed back towards medical anthropology, where you know, a classic study of something like tension, or a lot of the literature in South Asia on something like tension. And I think if one was to apply this framework to Abu Abu, you could also come out with the same kind of outcome. A lot of it tries to think about it as depression or anxiety in another cultural language. So it's a kind of translation, a cultural form of a more universal, natural condition, right? And the will, therefore, is to taxonomize these forms. So if I'm looking for different kinds of tension, you know, these are like, there's tension that's like kamjori, so bodily weakness, that will also be a familiar term to South Asian speakers here. You know, there's tension that's like opera or black magic. There's tension that's like future tension. There's tension that's like Gurkha tension or household tension. And in my book and in my thesis, at the beginning, I was trying to like wrestle these different forms down and say, oh, well, the married women are experiencing the Gurkha tension because of this, and the young women are experiencing future tension because of this. And that was just such an over determination of this much more unsettling affective experience that was really slippery, that was often contradictory, that was sometimes seen as something that could be solved by medical forms, but more often seen as something that was resistant to medicine and things like that. So the whole idea of tension as a kind of atmospheric pushed back against the biomedical way of thinking about mental distress, and kind of presented itself as an emic challenge to the way in which people were theorizing what was being called depression or anxiety for those from the global south. And I think what I found really helpful in trying to theorize that affective atmosphere was a kind of braiding of different, I found like different sources of theory on atmosphere really helpful. So there was a kind of literature on affect and atmosphere, and atmospheres related to climate change from anthropology, so the anthropology of emotion, by people like Michael Schnegg, Jason Throop, Tina Gameltoft, which really tried to think with this idea of dwelling, what is between the subject and the object. And there's a really nice quote that I just pulled here from Michael Schnegg, where he says that an atmosphere is both an objective ontological entity and an intersubjective experience of bodies that experience it. And here I quote, as something that permeates human bodies and is in between atmospheres, and here I say like tension, evade the established cause and effect scheme according to which the object causes the subject to feel. So you have this kind of explosion of cause and effect, of subject and object, that becomes really meaningful when you're thinking about how distress works relationally, rather than locating distress in an individual body that is to be treated by another object, or pain to be caused by one person to another. Because oftentimes what was really interesting about tension was that it was contagious, right? You know, people, and it also was absorbed by some bodies more than others. And I want to come back to this a little bit later when we maybe talk a bit about inequalities, but the question of who feels what kind of atmospheric affect, who absorbs or becomes responsible for that affect, and then who is able to articulate that in what kind of genre of speech, becomes a question of inequality. So whose bodies, what kind of tension settled in whose bodies created those very bodies, and the inequalities between those bodies. So that's a kind of a core thing that I try and map out in my book. But I think what was really helpful is, rather than only relying on the anthropology of atmosphere, I also found it really helpful to look at two other sources. So one was thinking about kind of more classical and historical ideas of ras and bhava in South Asian literature. So bhava meaning mood, ras meaning the essence of the body, and the idea in South Asian aesthetics that you can cultivate certain moods through certain aesthetic practices. So that really helped me to try and understand, how are people talking about these moods, and how are their bodies generating certain kinds of moods through which kind of symbolic schema. But then also to politicize this, to bring the anthropology of emotion together with South Asian theories, but also with the kind of atmosphere of critical race theory. So you find atmospheres and you find frequencies, which I found a really helpful way of thinking about different atmospheric genres or affective constellations in work by people like Tina Campt and Paul Gilroy, that in turn are drawing on theories of tension and embodied embodied oppression by people like Frantz Fanon. So I think atmosphere is really atmospherics is a really fertile way of, as Sophie says, pushing against these erasures of classificatory schema.
Thank you both so much. That's incredibly helpful. I just want to, before I move on to the next question, just for people in the audience, to remind you to begin formulating your questions, which you can put in the chat. I have a few more questions and then we'll turn to yours, but please feel free to put questions in the chat at any time. So I'm going to turn to a question around the kinds of violence that kind of manifest through the environment. So a range of scholars in the environmental humanities have made arguments around the weaponization of the environment and landscapes as being a distinctive feature of colonial modernity. So this idea that, colonial violence is often meted out, not in acts of necessarily spectacular violence, but often slow violence that unfurls through the landscape and through ecologies. So for today's conversation, I want to think about this in relation to the kind of breathability of the air, and making the air unbreathable through means as varied as, chemical warfare to pollution is one way in which the environment and literally the air that surrounds us can be weaponized. So I wanted to ask, could you each speak about how the environment or local ecologies have been weaponized in the context in which you work, and whether the breathability of the air has been a dimension of that? So Sophie, I'll go to you, and then Nikita. Yeah.
Thank you, Raffaella. Another really fantastic question that I hadn't actually really thought about my work through the lens of, and this is why these sorts of seminars are so good to think with, sort of reframing the angle on the question. Weaponization, yes. I mean, I think my embryonic thinking of this is sort of in the companionship of Astrida Neymanis, who's written some really wonderful things about everyday militarisms and the ways in which weaponization becomes sedimented and embedded in the mundane, in the routine, in ways that are often become unseen or invisibilized. I mean, I think in Papua and in other places for that matter, where plantations are exploding or proliferating, there is certainly, you could talk about the weaponization of certain conceptualizations of the environment as an instrument to further settler colonial capitalist agendas. In Papua, for instance, plantations are invariably described and promoted as modern natures, right? Modern forests, even I've heard that expression used, embodiments of progress and development and civilization that, of course, stand in counterpoint to what is not plantation, i.e. forest, as the embodiment of that which is idle, that which is unproductive, and that which is backward, that which is sort of just sitting there passively waiting to be rendered useful or productive at the hands of corporations and laborers, rendered useful, if you wish. So that sort of weaponization of discourses of pristine, idle natures is really instrumental to furthering what is perceived to be a useful nature for the ends of certain humans in any case. And that weaponization of one understanding of the environment, of course, often works alongside the weaponization of deeply racialized understandings of the people who inhabit these environments, right? That indigenous peoples too are in need of development, of progress, of sort of uplifting from a sort of putative backwardness and so forth. So the intersections of race, ecology, species, and modernity sort of all kind of really entangled within these discourses. And I think one thing that I want to say, though, on plantations, particularly in the Southeast Asian context, is that while all of these weaponizations are having real and rampant impacts in the particular locale where I'm working, air's weaponization also vastly transcends the boundaries of the plantation itself, right? every year, haze and smoke raised by the illegal burning of forests to make way for these monocrops affects the whole region and causing all manner of health issues in Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore. This is an annual phenomenon, right? So air is diffuse, air travels, air refuses containment. And in some ways, there's a deep paradox in the fact that that weaponization then in some ways comes back to the very places often where these corporations are headquartered, where their investors are located. You know, in that sense, perhaps there is some truth to Chakrabarti's notion that there are no lifeboats for the rich and the privileged in the context of climate change, because air bites back, and air's weaponization ends up coming to haunt the lives and landscapes and lungs of those in places far removed from the out of the way frontiers where these plantations and this burning and this air pollution is happening. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Sophie. Yeah, I think what you're talking about kind of the weaponization of pure ideas of nature is really, really important. I mean, the world over in this moment, and particularly around discourses of ecological distress, because communities like those that we work with, who have livelihoods that are attached to the environment and who have these kind of deep relational links that are encoded in their, that are their religiosity. Become suddenly very as Alice Rudge, my wonderful colleague at SOAS, and her colleagues speak about, they're seen as both the perfect victims and the perfect solution to the climate crisis, right? And so this puts them in a really difficult spot. I mean, there's this often in a lot of literature on ecological distress in mental health. Communities like this are seen as having eco-social selves, which is a term that's used by ethnopsychiatrists like Lawrence Kiermaier. And that I've always found a really kind of curious way of thinking about what an Indigenous livelihood is, which, I mean, can you even call the Gadian Indigenous community? That's its own kind of debate against kind of global vistas of indigeneity and wider kind of caste and tribal politics that features differently in India. But this question of are they somehow more affected by environmental change than other people becomes one that is it is in itself racializing. So I suppose what I'm working through at the moment is trying to think about what is an emic theory of ecological distress, and how does that complicate this kind of association of an eco-social self with the environment. And I come back to the question about in what ways the environment has been weaponized in the context of work here. And I think weaponized probably isn't the word, but in a community for whom a livelihood and a religiosity is based on of agropastoralism kind of frames social identity. What happens when that livelihood is gone? What happens when that land is gone? What happens when the animals are gone? And for the Gadi people, I think the present is so fraught because the aesthetic representations of nature in different ways are at stake in how in who is included and who isn't included in notions of godliness. So, for example, you have a younger generation of people who have never practiced shepherding and never will. They don't want to. They wouldn't. A shepherd is not a desirable husband. It's not a very economically viable livelihood. It's not very cool. Shepherds are smelly. They have to be away from home all the time. One would much rather open a cafe or be a trekking guide or go to Dubai or go to Kerala in the tourist season. But at the same time, there's a will to kind of retain this deep connection to a particular kind of bucolic landscape. So I think things as I say, weaponization isn't the right word. It's more like the environment is represented in new ways. So you have a whole genre of Gadi music that has these amazing kind of drone shots of the beautiful Himalayan landscape and the Gadi in a kind of traditional dress, herding sheep and goats, even though none of those people in that film will have ever herded sheep and goats. But then that kind of creates a lot of distress for those who do still practice shepherding or who are trying to kind of continue an intergenerational transmission of knowledge that they've learned from their fathers and grandfathers of place-based gods and work with animals and plants. So you have this kind of disconnect where there's a kind of new Gadiness and it's leaving behind an old Gadiness, each of which have different representations of the environment. And you have the result is kind of deep conflicts and rifts in what constitutes masculinity, what constitutes Gadi kind of authentic identity, what constitutes autochthony, what constitutes indigeneity. And those in turn are kind of reframed by Hindu nationalist discourses. So I suppose what my answer to your question is more how do we track the many different representations of nature that are at stake in the way in which people are grappling with these kind of unsettling affects like tension in the Gandhi case, or perhaps like Abu or other affects in Sophie's case.
Thank you so much. That's incredibly helpful and expands a lot of, I think, that literature in really productive ways. So I'm going to turn back to this concept of atmospherics, right, which, as I kind of alluded to in the introduction and your comments have already touched on, right, has this interesting kind of play on words, right, like atmospherics in a material sense, the air that we breathe, alongside the affective sense, the atmosphere of collective moods or individually perceived senses of place. So I was curious in what sense the concept of atmospherics is relevant in your work, and I know you've both sort of already begun to allude to that, but also what it might reveal, right? What does this lens kind of throw into relief that other concepts, you know, maybe don't help us grasp? So again, if we go Sophie, Nikita.
Thanks, Raffaella. So I think for this question, I'm going to take it into a slightly different direction, a slightly different landscape of atmospherics. I talked about Abu Abu, this sort of emic concept that speaks to material and sort of ontological uncertainty and murkiness in the actual literal field where I'm doing conducting this research. I think I want to invite us here to think about the uncanny and atmospherics in the context of actually the disciplines that we're operating in, right? Because I think there's some interesting resonances here between the sort of uncertainty, doubt, you know, mistrust that very much animates the field side that I'm working in, and kind of where anthropology is at this particular temporal juncture, right? A time at which the sort of atmosphere of what doing anthropology is and what being an anthropologist means, you know, brings into question the broader values, uses, and ethics of what not only what is good anthropology, but what good anthropology is, right? To riff off the title of a recent special issue in American Ethnologist, I believe. So for me, and I want to bring this up because it's something that my interlocutors in Papua themselves are the first to raise, right? I too am very much an Abu Abu being, and I have relationships with them that we've cultivated over a decade now. But sustaining those relations of trust and companionship and it's a constant work in progress, right? There is always doubt and uncertainty over my own interests, my own desires, what I'm going to do with the knowledges and insights that I'm privy to in the field, right? How do they transform across the different platforms and spaces that they then get distributed and disseminated across, including this one. So I think there's a resonance here between the Abu-Abu-ness of spaces where people are literally fighting to breathe, and then the Abu-Abu-ness of the spaces of scholarly knowledge production, where this question of accountability, authority, really are increasingly questioned. And here it's rendering the unseen seen for all the right reasons, which is kind of in some ways the opposite of what's happening in the field, where that which should be invisible is becoming seen for all the wrong reasons. And I think atmospherics helps me think through that, actually, helps me think through questions of hesitation, of non-innocence, of impurity, of compromise, of the promise of ethnographic narratives and uncovering the unseen, whilst also reckoning with the compromises that come with any kind of narrative or storytelling or representation about others' lived worlds. And of course, that is particularly the case for myself as a non-Indigenous scholar researching Indigenous life worlds and trying to do justice to the richness of those worlds and the worlds people use to story them. So a bit of again, a bit left field, but I think there might be some interesting connective tissues there between atmospherics in fields and in fields in both senses of the term, right? Ethnographic field sites and disciplinary fields. The importance of staying with that uncertainty and that murkiness and putting it to work in ways that are meaningful, that are coalitional, that are anchored in a kind of reckoning of the colonial capitalist undergirdings of scholarly, of academia itself, and the sort of ways in which we build our culture and capital off these increasingly, fractured life worlds, to borrow Nikita's term. And I think that the usefulness of that kind of thinking across fields in both senses of the term, for me, also helps me think through ideas of aspirational justice, right? And here again, I'm borrowing from my wonderful colleague Blanche Verlee, who's written about aspirational justice, both as this idea of what does it mean to breathe together, collective breathing across species lines, and what does it also mean to think about justice and the aspiration of justice differently, both in plantation frontiers, in my case, and in the context of academia. What are we aspiring to in telling these stories together? What are we? What forms of breathing together are we trying to cultivate? Not least, at a particular moment in time when you could argue that the very fact of living and breathing has become a political act and a struggle that intersects with questions of justice, both multi-species, metabolic, social, racial, environmental, in all kinds of different concatenations. So that's my invitation to think about atmospherics across across fields in all senses of the term.
Oh, thank you, Sophie, because that, I think I've spoken a lot about how atmospherics theoretically, frames my work and what it's done for me in unlocking a lot of, political potentialities in thinking about distress. But I think I'm going to take up your invitation and riff on it and think, I suppose, uh, uh, I think when I did my PhD fieldwork, I was very naive. I went into my field site, and I was basically found by these two amazing people, one of whom is a Gandhi shepherd, and the other of whom was a new media artist, and we lived together and did all of our work together in different ways. And I wrote this thesis, and I got my job, and I'm writing my book, um, we're deeply ingrained still and entangled in each other's lives still, even as fictive kin, but they don't get anything out of this project, right? In terms of value. And so when I went back and I started thinking about the atmosphere of my discipline when I returned, and you've had this kind of deep turn towards really thinking deeply about epistemic parity and also thinking about different forms of output, right? Like different kinds of genres by which we can speak, the significance of the public university in both facilitating the generation of knowledge and the need to kind of uh, uh, smuggle, or I think scholars talk about it as a kind of a fugitive, sustain a fugitive economy, became really clear and pressing for me. And I really like the model that Megan Rashig speaks about in her work published in Cultural Anthropology and I think the Feminist Review, which is where she works with a community in Salinas and she that runs a healing circle, and she uses her research funds, but also her kind of ability to host public spaces to be able to sustain those kind of healing circles and the creation of art in that community. So I really learned from her, I learned from others. And when I came back to look at the question of ecological distress after I'd finished my PhD, I sat down with these two colleagues of mine who are called Sham and Sujanya. I can name them because they're amazing artists in their own right. And we decided what were they going to get out of this book? What was Project Tension for them? And they decided that they didn't want to do anything directly activist because that wasn't going to be productive, or other people could do it better. But what they wanted to do was make art. And since then, they've been successful in having a Foundation of Indian Contemporary Art Fellowship for Himalayan artists over the last year, and they produced an artistic render of the book and of Tension. It's called Project Tension, and it's particularly about ecological distress. And so what they did is, we have so many interviews that we all did together and so much data, but then they went back and produced other different forms of photography, videos, sound recordings, and they collected material culture objects, and they created this kind of they thought, how do I create the atmosphere of this book in an art installation? And so that just exhibited in Delhi in the end of last year, in December, and hopefully we'll be able to exhibit it in other places in the world. But what it is a dera, so a shepherd campsite that Sham, as a former shepherd, brings in on his back, and as Sujanya sings traditional Gaddi songs, and they set up this particular installation that includes, so you kind of lie back on this beautiful kind of hand-woven rug that's made from the sheep and goat wool, and what is projected above you are these kind of scenes of clouds rolling in that really pick up this kind of atmosphere of opacity that Sophie's talking about, of doubt and uncertainty. And you hear people reading vignettes from the ethnography, from the book, and that voice actors from the Gadi community retelling those. And so, I mean, I didn't do anything. Like this wasn't, they did this. I had nothing to do with it, really. We did our work together, but this is their render of what we did together. And I couldn't have imagined being able to be part of that kind of project. And I feel so privileged to see, an atmosphere we felt together empirically in the ethnographic encounter being rendered in two completely different ways. For me, in really trying to think about how do I deploy ethnographic writing, which I think is so evocative of atmosphere in Sophie's book, in Raffaella's writing, and I really practice a practice of ethnographic writing to convey that atmosphere with the kind of artistic material culture that they were able to provide in their artistic installation. So maybe that's an example that speaks to some of Sophie's really cogent framings of this difficult moment in the discipline.
No, thank you both so much. That's incredibly generative. So I'm going to kind of pivot to a question that I feel has maybe been sort of haunting this discussion, right, which is questions of indigeneity, indigenous sovereignty, and indigenous land management practices. So especially in the aftermath of climate disasters, I think this is particularly pronounced in the United States, especially after wildfires. I imagine also in Australia as well. There are kind of more widespread calls to revitalize indigenous land management practices, which is sort of an acknowledgement of the role that colonialism has played in the destruction of ecosystems, as well as a kind of belated response to long-standing demands by communities to centre Indigenous perspectives in environmental management. So I'm just curious how in each of your contexts, which obviously have their distinct historical contours, how you respond to those kind of calls, how you understand those calls, and what you might think, what they might mean for political action. So yeah, Sophie.
Thanks so much, Raffaella. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I want to start by answering this question by perhaps anticipating critiques of what is sometimes described as the sort of romanticization of Indigenous land management practices and relationships to the environment. And here I've always found the work of Elaine Coburn, Eileen Morton Robinson, George Sefade, and Makere Stewart Harawira really helpful to think with. They, in their work, defend the so-called romanticization of Indigenous land management practices and ecological relations, because they argue that these affirmations need to be read contrapuntally against contexts of ongoing colonization and as a form of resistance to centuries of stigmatization of Indigenous ways of knowing and being. And they go further than that to argue that, if there's any epistemology or ontology that has been thoroughly romanticized but not acknowledged as such, it's modern capitalism, right? Its promise, what it can give us, and the sort of the trap of the material future that it offers us, right? So it's a really interesting way to think about romanticization and kind of push back against what is sometimes, the response one sometimes gets when one enters this sort of space of revitalization of Indigenous ways of being. I mean, my response to that, based on my research, is that this revitalization and recentering of Indigenous ways of being and knowing it's being led by Indigenous peoples themselves, right? And of course, there are huge internal differentiations and variation and divisions, for that matter, in terms of how that revitalization should unfold. Very rarely is it a desire to return to some kind of pristine past. It's more about what it means to make do, right? What it means to live better together with these introduced eco-capitalist formations, rather than a sort of either or between a kind of pristine past and a sort of future that's captive to capitalism. My role has been more to sort of help to uncover the complexities of the practices and discourses that surround these forms of revitalization and resurgence to document the challenges that people face on the ground in advocating for the protection and preservations of their territories and resources in the face of often highly predatory state and corporate audiences, to sort of uncover the internal frictions that animate these forms of advocacy and politic, both across gendered and intergenerational and rural-urban divides in West Papua. I've been trying to also, do justice to the ways in which strategic essentializations of what Indigenous means, what indigeneity is and does, also are really instrumental at times in helping people be heard and heeded by audiences who may not be interested in songs and stories, who may not be willing to stay with the trouble of Abu Abu, right? And for whom simplified reductionist discourses are in fact more useful in terms of actually leading to action, right? So that side of the story. And I think for me, throughout all of these endeavors of I suppose what Tolbert might call standing with, right, is that question of who gets to do that work of recentering. How does that bring into question questions of positionality and obligation for us as scholars, including as, applied anthropologists or engaged anthropologists? How do we combine, this imperative of telling bitter stories about air, about aspirations, about futures, with practical engagements in support of the worlds that are stories, in some ways also world, who gets to speak with and for air, and the people that air, conspires with in different ways, and how in the process do we still retain theory, of course, and theorization, but not as an end in itself, and more, I suppose, as what Teresa Te Aiwa would call an or, right? Something that helps gets us places. helps to get us places as we travel along these journeys of trying to uncover other worlds together and otherwise, right? How do we use it as a tool to further our thinking and our being and our relating in other kinds of ways? And in the process, how do we not just experience the rightful sense of outrage about what's happening to the air, to the planet, to our atmospheres, but then put that outrage to work, right? In ways that are generative. I don't want to use the word productive, but I'm going to use it, that are productive across the different communities of life who come together in these processes of aspiring together, if always unevenly and differently across space and across time. So sorry, a very diffuse answer to a very concrete question, but hopefully some food for thought.
Thanks, Sophie. That's, yeah, always so amazing to hear you speak about the kind of affordances of your work. I think for in the Gadi case, it's difficult to speak about the Gadi as an indigenous group. I think that in itself is a contested question that I'm learning a lot about the kind of history of indigeneity in India and how that is kind of implicated in particular forms of colonial classification. Gadis themselves wouldn't describe themselves necessarily as Adivasi or forest dwellers like other communities from Eastern India, but they are classified as scheduled tribe, which affords some parts of that community certain privileges, but then other people who are Gadi speaking but low caste, Dalits, some identify as Dalits, are blocked out of that kind of ST status and its affordances. So the question of indigeneity is an unsteady one and is part of this kind of complex atmosphere of uncertainty, the fraught nature of the present, whereby people are seeking to claim different forms of social identity and status that then generates new forms of inequality and the affects of disorientation that go with them. So the very question of indigeneity itself is really destabilized by the Gadi case and the Gadi present, but I also think provides an interesting case to read alongside the work of others like Pinky Hota, Aritong Longkumar, etc., who are thinking about what indigeneity and autochthony means in this Hindu nationalist moment, where people might be Adivasis and their ability to claim indigeneity or autochthony with the land has a new meaning as that land is sacralized by new kind of national religious or religio-nationalist imaginaries. But in terms really practically of how, if we take maybe emic rather than indigenous, marginalized perspectives towards forms of distress, then I think that what my work tries to do is think about what would happen if the emic theory of distress was put along par with the biomedical modernist theory of distress. And that's not to say that, as my wonderful colleague Neil Armstrong puts it, that there's a kind of representative arms race, right? That we're trying to say that anthropological or emic representations are better than biomedical representations. For, Gadi people will use different complex etiologies of their own affective experiences. But to say that how do you think about these things in a parity? How do you think about the ways in which emic theorizations render visible forms of suffering that are occluded or even generated by biomedical classifications or other ethic classifications? And I really, really am inspired by Sophie and Dion Nanari's chapter or article here about which I've forgotten the exact name of right now, but maybe Sophie, you can jump in. Decolonizing climate.
Yeah, that one.
Decolonizing climate change. Yeah, and this article, I mean, it was so amazing for me to read as I was writing the conclusion of my book, to think about, what is one doing in listening to an emic theory, and what kind of how do and these are kind of theories in relation to climate change. Who gets to do the theorization? And Sophie, I don't know if you want to jump in there at all with any illustrations of that article, but yeah.
I'm loath to take up more space, but I do want to plug it just because it was such a wonderful collaboration with Dion, who's a Samoan scholar and also High Chief. And you know, really, this article is all about offering a sort of a toolkit to you know, stimulate other ways of imagining climate change. You know, an imaginary that is relational, that is multidisciplinary, that is emplaced, embodied, that is sensory, that is reflexive, and that is more than human. And you know, the sort of kind of, yeah, all these different facets to ways of reclaiming the imagination, and making it a different kind of battleground, if you wish, to borrow Benjamin's terms,
Mm,
in each topic.
It was extremely helpful to me in because I think before I read it, or I was thinking, oh, I have to say the EMIC is better than the ETIC, and it's not. That's not the point. It's to say that how do you change the change the battleground, as you say, and think about ways in which I think you have this beautiful part where you talk about how emic theorizations of climate change afford a praxis of sovereignty. You know, they do things in the world. Theories do things in the world. So anthropologists are in a really unique position to amplify the theories that are not usually amplified. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you both so much. So we have a question in the public chat, and also one that has come from our Associate Director, Justine, which is not visible in the public chat because of the way that the Zoom is set up. But let me start with the question from Uta in the public chat, where she says, I'm interested to see what happens to the matter of pluralism, colonialism, emic perspectives, weaponization of the environment, and dispossession when we widen the experience of alter living to non-Indigenous lives as a planetary atmospheric predicament. So in here, she's thinking of the elemental turn at large as a turn against classification. Writings of Water and Dust come to mind, of the urban lives of Kolkata cyclists that Malini Sur writes of Glenn Albrecht's work on psychoteraptic conditions, of Sarah Gillespie's Climate Change and Consciousness, of Kate Rigby's work on creation. So I think there's a question around this question of alter living in relation to non-Indigenous lives and this as a kind of planetary predicament. So I wondered if either of you would like to speak to that. And we have another question around sort of disenchantment and religion as well. So if let me know if one of you or other of you would like to take that, and then we can turn to the final question.
Nikita, I'm happy for you to take the lead on this one if you'd like.
Yeah, sure. Gosh, it's such an interesting question, and really it's really helpful to take as a comment. I mean, I was scribbling down all of these really interesting references that I can't wait to get stuck into. I suppose when we widen to non-Indigenous lives, I think this is kind of what I was getting at when I wanted to decenter the question of indigeneity in what the Gadi perspective is and think more about the emic. So I think that's probably summarizes how I would answer this. I mean, there is another version of this talk where I talk about my second project, which is actually way more related to air, which is about mold and indoor atmospheric conditions in Somali communities who experience kind of protracted displacement in forms of temporary accommodation in Birmingham in the UK. And I suppose that's been a really activist project rather than this kind of deep theoretical long-term engagement in a place. But it's really been about how does air, indoor air, become both the source of blame and the source of evidence by which one can push back against a violent state. So in the Somali context, women were living in temporary accommodation provided for by the state. They were in that temporary accommodation because they were statutorily homeless for different kinds of reasons. They were citizens of the UK, so they had, they were they had rights to those homes, and they'd in a project that I did with my collaborator Suad Dwale, a community psychotherapist, and Elizabeth Storer, a health geographer, we basically looked at the way in which mold particularly came up as a complex symbol in these women's lives, where the experience of living in a moldy house basically was blamed on women's cultural practices of ritual bathing, cooking rice, the very explorations of the body, breath, and then not opening windows. So in this instance, there's a kind of recursivity of the way in which blame works. The very body who produces the moisture is blamed for becoming sick from the product of that moisture, which totally displaces the real source of that bodily of mold, which is the structural seep holes in the house. You know, the fact that the house is in complete disrepair and it's not being fixed by a state who's obliged to fix it. So so I think there's lots of, to answer your question, there's lots of opportunities to widen this question. And I think what was interesting for me was that I could only do that project with the Somali women and center these questions of race, ecology, atmosphere, because I had done the project on tension and thinking about tension and how bodies hold distress and interact with the environment. To use Karen Barrad's term, really helped me to understand what was going on in the Somali case.
Thank you so much, Nikita. And I actually think that's a really, Sophie, were you about to jump in? Yeah, no, okay.
I know we're at time. It's all
Yes,
good.
yeah. So just in the interest of sticking to time, I think that's a lovely place to end, because it also helps us think about the connections that kind of spiral out from these very particular places that both of you are working from, but kind of do have these, like, you know, the spores that kind of percolate outwards. So thank you so much, both of you. Really, we've been so delighted to have you both as speakers in this series. We've been looking forward to this event for a very long time, and I think it's a really wonderful way to end this series. Thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing other people at future IRCPL events as well. Thank you everyone in the audience for coming, and thank you both, Nikita and Sophie.
Thank you so much,
So
Raffaella.
delighted. Thank you, Raffaella, and thank you to our wonderful audience.
Thank you.